when I see the incident that happened with the feminist event, which your users, and viewers are probably aware of, what happened there was a failure of conversation. And what led to that event, and what led to Islam and the Future of Tolerance, is this curiosity. How do we have better conversations? How do we have difficult conversations without losing our humanity? So my name is Desh Amila, and I am an immigrant, now called Australia home. I'm originally from Sri Lanka. I moved here as a teenager in 2000. Came here to study filmmaking. It took me roughly about 16 years before I made my first film. That's generally the immigrant experience. I started running events in 2005. My initial events were in the hip-hop and R&B arenas, and that eventually led me to start an organization called Thinking, which was the world's first intellectual touring company. And that was I came up with the concept in 2010. First event was in 2011. That didn't go to plan. It was perceived to be massively successful, but financially from the back end, it was not. And then I restarted the concept. I changed around the concept a little and then relaunched it in 2013. And in 2014, it took off. And then last year, I sold my company and set up This Is 42. So that's a very quick my journey.
Sure. So how would you describe what you do now?
So This Is 42. I mean, the idea is, again, I'm trying to create something that doesn't necessarily exist. I'm trying to create the world's first intellectual lifestyle brand. It's not a thing. It's just a sort of an idea in my head. See, what I want to do is I want to, from the beginning, even from the thinking days, I want to bring intellectual conversation to the mainstream, and in a manner that is perceived to be cool and anybody can be engaged. Because when I got interested in the intellectual subject matters and philosophy and science, it felt like it was a sort of closed community. It was either in academia or sort of really high-end conferences, and the mainstream didn't seem to be partaking in this kind of activity. So I wanted to see, how do I get the people who attend to these sort of hip-hop and R&B events that I put on, like thousands of people, how do I get them to come to intellectual events? That was sort of the genesis of what I do. So with This Is 42, what I want to do is continue the tradition and move it from not just from Australia and New Zealand, but also do things in America, do things in some Asian countries. And also I've set up a media company which we've just started producing long form intellectual content. We've got some podcasts, we've got some a video series on YouTube. We are working on another feature film, and there's just a couple of things we're doing. So it's a bit different to Thinking. It's I like to consider it as the evolution of what I originally started.
How did you think of combining hip hop with intellectual conversations? That's so interesting.
See, this is the thing. So the general perception of rap music is quite skewed. They generally has a sort of somewhat of a negative connotation. But as somebody who when I moved here, Australia, from a country like Sri Lanka, I was looking for a home. I was looking for a place to belong to, and I immediately found refuge in the hip hop community. The struggle of a certain group of people and the music that came with that, I identified myself with that as an immigrant. And as I was part of that community, I realized how rich it was. Hip hop is a culture. It's not just the music. It's the clothes, it's the music, it's the DJing, it's the dancing, it's the graffitiing. And I realized that's why it's such a big industry now. Now it's very commercialized, but behind the scenes, the conversations people were having were philosophical. They were about, just general philosophy. They were about, race. They were about economy. They were about entrepreneurship. And I'm like, but this doesn't, come out in if you just listen to the top 10 hits. So I was part of that sort of environment, but that group of people didn't go to academic events, and I had a personal journey where I went through a sort of trying to understand where do I fit in with regards to religion, because I was born into a Buddhist family. I call myself a Buddhist most of my life, and then I went through a journey where I became a born-again Christian, and then I, left that. Then I read the Quran inside out. Then I read the Bhagavad Gita. Then I read the Mormon Bible. I went through this massive journey, and then I got introduced to amazing philosophers like Daniel Dennett, to Sam Harris, to Steven Pinker, to eventually, Richard Dawkins, and the New Atheist movement. And I realized I'm really an atheist. But I was still in the hip hop community. And that's when I thought, hey, can I use my knowledge in how to pull thousands of people to hip hop event and marketing knowledge that I had to intellectual events? And that's sort of the, my test ground was in 2011. I tried to do a music festival, but more of a grounded in intellectual ideas. It was too ambitious for the Australian market, and that's why I said it just didn't work the first time around.
Was it called Fire Festival? No, I'm just kidding.
The bane of my existence. People bring it up. When that documentary came out, the sheer number of people messaged me and emailed saying, yo, you've got to see this thing. I'm like, I know. When it was happening as an event organizer, before the documentaries, when they first announced, I was like, people can see through this, right? Like, this is not going to happen the way we saw it, but rest is history.
Yeah, that's so. Oh gosh, well that could be a whole episode right there. Well, that's so interesting. I mean, so where did you get your entrepreneurial drive from? Because everything that you're saying now kind of screams entrepreneur in and out.
Survival. I moved here. My whole journey is a series of unlikely scenarios. I was born in a small town called Badulla in Sri Lanka. I was the first in my family to leave Badulla to go to Colombo, the big city, because of a scholarship when I was in grade 5. And I was the first to leave the country. So when I got on a plane to come to Australia, I've never been on a plane. And I thought I understood English. And I came to Australia, and people in Australia started speaking, and I was like, I have no idea what's going on. My perception, of the West and my what I thought I was walking into was very different to what I walked into. And then from there on, everything I've done is pure survival. I don't necessarily have a background in entrepreneurship or businesses. Both my parents are, government workers in Sri Lanka. They're both school teachers. And Sri Lankan culture doesn't really have a sort of a positive light towards entrepreneurship back in the day when I was growing up there. So this is purely survival for me. And then over time, it took me a very long time to get to a point of what you would call success.
That's so interesting, because I hear that from so many entrepreneurs that like what not what they say, but like so many immigrants tend to have this entrepreneurial spirit to them. I think do you know who Gary Vaynerchuk is?
Of course I know Gary Vee.
So he talks about, because he's an immigrant as well, and he's like the quintessential entrepreneur, and he always says, I am the way I am because I'm an immigrant. And he's like, I am the way I am because I have this like chip on my shoulder. And he's like, that's what's driven me to do all that I've done. I think it's just super interesting.
Absolutely. I definitely have a chip on my shoulder. For me, there's also that, especially nowadays, I visit and I tend to speak to a lot of people. Actually, just before this, call, I met with a young entrepreneur. She came to the last event, the feminist event, the infamous feminist event that I held. and she was in the audience, and she has an idea to start an events company. I spent an hour just sort of mentoring her, just telling her, what I think should happen. Yesterday, I met with a young filmmaker who said about my film, and I spent an hour sort of mentoring them. I love doing that, and especially for immigrants, because, man, I wish the 19-year-old me who came over here had somebody like me, because it took me such a long 14 years before I finally got the hang of things.
Well, I mean, so you've given some pretty poignant statements on your views today and where they come from your upbringing in Sri Lanka. And I know that your mission now, or I don't want to speak for you, I don't want to say your mission, but one of the things you do now is you really want to help people engage with each other. And you've spoken about your experience in the Sri Lankan Civil War and how that's helped mold your views on that. And I was wondering if you would feel comfortable talking about that a little bit more.
Yes, more than happy to. It's something that I have grown to learn more, especially in retrospect. When I was living in Sri Lanka, I thought I was living in the best country in the world. There's a statement like, your lived experience is something that, it's unparalleled to anything else. But then you move yourself out of that sort of bubble, then you realize, oh, wait, what I thought was perfection is very different to what really is happening. So when I was living there as a child growing up, I remember little things like, when a suicide bomb goes off nearby and, 40, 50 people are killed, and then the retaliation attack happens from the government forces and 70 of the terrorists are killed, I excel. And I say things like, well, they killed 40 of us, we killed 70 of them. As a child, that's what I was used to. And I remember, hearing my parents say now, easily racist things. And I didn't find any of that, anything wrong with it. But since I've moved to the West, since I, again, start reading sort of, philosophy and intellectual subject matter, I started seeing the world for what it is. And I realized, being involved in some of the reconciliation work that's happening in Sri Lanka, and very recently, we had a private screening of my movie in Sri Lanka, and I was part of a small group of people that had a conversation from like 9:30 at night till 3 o'clock in the morning. Just hearing those conversations happen, I realized this is a crucial missing element. If this existed the way I would like it to be, we may not have had the civil war that we had for 27, 28 years. See, I was born in 1981, and that's the beginning of the civil war in Sri Lanka, which ended in 2009. Hundreds of thousands of my people perished, and that shouldn't have happened. And it had a lot to do with failed conversations. So for me, it's important that wherever I can, I help facilitate people having better conversations. And this is not to say that one has to agree with the other all the time, but we should be able to talk to people. But we've lost the art of conversation, and it is just quite disheartening to see. So whatever I can do, it's a bit of a, you're right, it is a bit of a mission of mine now.
Didn't you give some statistic? I can't quite remember. Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the statistics, what we found, so I helped found Sri Lanka Unites, the Melbourne chapter. The Sri Lankan chapter was found by Prashanta Visser, and now they have a version called Global Unites. So Sri Lanka Unites found that 70% of Sri Lankans have not had a meaningful conversation or a friend with the other. See, Sri Lanka is primarily made out of three ethnicities. You have Sinhalese, you have Tamil, and you have Muslim. And that statistic, when I found out, it really hit home, because I went to a school over there. We had a Tamil section. So we had a segregated section for Tamil students. And I remember meeting some, the Tamil students, but I never ever engaged in a meaningful conversation. I don't really have a friend per se from the Tamil section, and I was like, well, I'm part of the problem. We grew up like that. It's how society was, and that's a scary statistic when you realize 70% of a country just otherize another group of people, and it's the same with the Tamil minority. They also have never really had any meaningful conversation.
So it's just super segregated.
Well, the country is not segregated in a traditional manner. Like there are no sort of Tamil sections. Like it's not like that. But in day-to-day activities, people go to stores owned by Muslim people or Tamil people, but it's very transactional. There aren't deep friendships or things like that, and it's very transactional. That's not to say no one was doing it, but large majority of it was not happening. I'll give you it's anecdotal, but here's an example. So one of the things Sri Lanka Unites did was we had this a conference. It's a 5-day conference, and we invited youth leaders, so students 16, 17 years old. They are prefects of their schools from all around Sri Lanka, from different ethnicities. And they came in buses to this one place called Jaffna, which is the conference that I was part of. Future Leaders Conference was the name of the project. So they came in buses from different parts of Sri Lanka. When they came in, what we did, we mixed them up, and then we more or less forced them to stay and live with the other. But there's footage of this online. You can see some of the singular students from down south who's never interacted with a Tamil person basically said, I will refuse to stay with a Tamil. I won't do it. I just won't do it. And the Tamils were the same. I would not stay with a singular kid. No way. I want to stay with my people. And we forced them to live. And then we had strategically placed all these activities to bring them together later. You can see after 5 days, friendships were formed. But that shows you at the beginning that, we're talking about 16, 17-year-olds already forming this sort of perception of the other. They just did not want to interact with anybody else other than their own kind.
That's so interesting because, I think it's easy for me to say this because I've always grown up in America and especially Southern California where it is very diverse. So I hear stories like this and it's so it's so interesting. Do you think that this is why you're so curious now?
I absolutely do think that's the case because, some of the things that's happening, around us, I can relate back to, like I've seen this thing happen, but in a really violent and extreme way in the country I lived for 19 years. And, when I see the incident that happened with the feminist event, which your users, and viewers are probably aware of, what happened there was a failure of conversation. And what led to that event, and what led to Islam and the future of tolerance is this curiosity. How do we have better conversations? How do we have difficult conversations without losing our humanity? And that was the purpose. It stems from where I come from.
Yeah,
it is part of the current experience.
And I want to ask you about the feminist event and your experience making the film. But before we do, what are your thoughts on the general state of discourse today? Because I know that for us in this show, I think this is one of the reasons why, I was drawn to talk with you is because I feel like we actually have very similar goals here. Is that we just feel like the state of the conversation is not in a good place right now. And so I'm curious to know on your thoughts.
I really listened to Christopher Hitchens' Hitch 22 not so long ago, and listening to it, I realized, man, Hitch saw this coming 10 years ago.
Who is this?
Christopher Hitchens. If you're not familiar with Hitch, pardon my accent.
No, it's the reception, not your accent.
But it's this was predicted a long time ago by some people saw where the world was heading, and whatever's happening in the world, this is actually the doing of people in power, people in governance, not really seeing the world for what it is. It's for some of the policies and some of the conversations and some of the things that happen on sort of mainstream media and some of the policies have led us to the point where the world is quite segregated, and the platforms we have for communication aren't helping better communication. Rather, it is putting us into silos, whether we like it or not. And that is, again, I mean, I remember I had the privilege of having this conversation with, Sam and a few other people.
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris and Brian Greene and a few people like that. When you watch Terminator, the Hollywood's version of the AI apocalypse is just that. It's violent. It's the machines rising up against you and shootings and things like that, where we're in cages and whatnot. But I think the AI revolution is more or less already happening, and it is having a huge impact on us. But they are algorithms. We just don't realize it is a form of AI. Right? Whatever the information the person who wrote the code put in here and the outcome from the algorithm in between, we have no idea what led the algorithm to come up with that stuff, because we're too many variables. It's because we can't calculate it. We get the algorithm to do it. And the byproduct of that is unintended consequences that's happening right now. Facebook and Zuckerberg and Jack and Twitter and Google can say they're trying to fix the problem, but the business model and the algorithms are built in a manner to appeal to some of the worst impulses of human nature. So with that combined with the biggest entertainer or the biggest loudspeaker in the world when it comes to almost anything is American television and American films and American news networks. They set the trend globally. If you look at those trends that have been set, they are quite polarizing. They're quite binary. And that, again, add to this sort of ongoing anxiety, this false narrative from both aisles of the spectrum, of political spectrum, where they're both fighting pure evil, right? Which is fundamentally a myth, right? Because the right thinks they are righteous and moral and they're fighting the pure evil. The left thinks the same thing. And I used to call myself an eternal optimist, but then life happened. So I'm more of a bit more of a realist optimist now, if that's even a term. I do think we are at a terrible place, and it is not getting any better. But some people are laying the groundwork. Maybe in 5, 6, 10 years, things will become better. But right now, we're in a, pardon my French, but we're in a clusterfuck of a situation, and we're just trying to figure out, okay, what do we do?
I'm so glad you're saying this, because I think I and us here at the show, we feel the exact same way. And I actually don't think, maybe the conversation is starting to happen a little bit more, but I'm actually surprised at the conversation around the effect that social media and mainstream media too, but I think everyone kind of knows what they're up to, but like especially social media, because of the algorithms, the effect that this is having on us and our conversation and how extreme it's making us, because what you see in your feeds, which are programmed for you specifically and the views that you already have, how we think that that's what the world is. We think that's what we're organically getting. So when they have these algorithms that just show us more of what we think, like, how can that not be dangerous and divisive? And it's so fun to me, and what do I know? But I feel like it's so obvious that it's not a good thing. And I get it that they have other priorities, like pleasing their advertisers and whatnot. But I personally feel like it's kind of why we're in the divisive state that we're in.
I think I absolutely agree. I mean, it's funny because social media then funnels through to mainstream media. There is still a large audience for mainstream media, and social media then also gives rise to in-groups. And those in-groups then have their own little websites and own little places where they consume what they want to consume, right? Before social media, it wasn't as simple to access whatever you want, and you consume sort of a primarily stuff in the middle. Then you make up your own mind. I remember seeing an article. So we just had an election in Australia, and this may be a bit confusing, but the Liberal Party over here are actually conservatives. They use the title Liberal, but they're conservatives. They're like the Republicans.
Gotcha.
And the Left Party are like the Democrats. They are small L liberals. And it was the sure shot. The Labour's going to win the election. It's the election they couldn't lose. And guess what? They lost.
So kind of what happened in America, pretty much, in 2016?
Yeah. And then there was an article I saw by a young woman. She wrote an article saying how she could not comprehend how this happened because all of her social media, 2,000 plus of her friends and everybody on Facebook, everyone knew they were going to win. But when they didn't, they were like, wait, what did I miss? How did I miss? I know about the echo chambers. I was careful not to be in that bubble. But then I realized when we lost, whether I like it or not, I am forced into that echo chamber, which is what you were talking about. It's super dangerous, even when we have a conscious effort. I mean, I remember having this a debate with somebody not so long ago, why I kept some people on my Facebook which had extreme views. I deliberately kept them so I know their view. We're talking about, people who are anti-vaccination, who are extreme activists on sort of the vegan movement, who have conservative views. Pro-guns in Australia it's not a thing over here, but I had some people, I deliberately kept them and interacted with them so maybe I could trick the algorithm. But if you look at the data available, we can't trick the algorithm. It will give you what you want to know because your subtlest movement, that only takes you like, 1/10 of a second during scrolling, it's recording it and it's adapting. You can't beat that.
Right. And think about how much effort that is. Like in you trying to have people in your algorithms that have diverse ideologies and views, you have to go through the effort of trying to click this, trying to connect with that person, trying to have this friend. And the vast majority of that's your like goal, right? Vast majority of people are not thinking that way.
So, I mean, like on the back of the feminist event, I actually removed all social media from my mobile. I'm still on social media. I use it as part of work during work hours. I have a small time allocated because, I mean, that event showed me the personal impact it can have on somebody. Because regardless what you may say, when you have 70,000 people on Twitter talking about something you were part of, and the sort of the veracity and the language, it can take anyone. It can take anyone down a really dark rabbit hole. I looked at it, and when my Twitter was blowing up, I'm like, you know what? I just removed it from I did not look at some of the things.
So you're not even really on social media anymore?
I am on social media, but my accounts are carefully pre-planned, in a way. Like, I do put things out, but I do it sort of like, when I come to the office, there's I have a half an hour, so I just put things out in that half an hour, and then I switch off. I don't look at it afterwards because it's, here's the funny thing. I thought I couldn't do that, especially with what I'm doing, but I'm not information poor because of it. I still read, the news articles and consume news the way I need to consume it. I used to consume back in the day, reading the BBCs and also the ABCs and whatever out there. And I read the books. I listen to the podcasts. That I listen to the diverse range of things, and I still seem to know what's going on. Now, I may not know when an incident happened immediately because my Twitter hasn't, I'm not seeing it on Twitter, but I find out about 3 hours later. But again, that has had zero impact in my life.
Oh my gosh, it's so funny you're saying this. I feel like we're kind of the same person. We're going through the same situation because I'm kind of the same in that, with the show, we've put ourselves on social media. We know we have to be involved there. But all of us here at the show, like, especially Twitter, all of us are pretty new to Twitter. And I think that that's probably the most toxic one. We're struggling with it. We are having a hard time with it. And we obviously can't not be on it. But I went through just not too long ago and unfriended everyone except for like maybe 30 people, and they're like comedians and just like kind of like people that post like nothing, because I couldn't handle it. It had nothing to do with agreeing or disagreeing. Otherwise, I would have followed people that I agreed with. It had to do with just it's too much information, and I just put something out the other day. We had on James Lindsay, a former guest of ours. He put out a tweet pretty much posing the question of, what's the point of Twitter these days? It's pretty much turned, this isn't what he said, but the way I interpreted it was, it's pretty much turned into a ranting and, negativity tunnel. The way that I looked at it was, we have so many other platforms for open and free-flowing information, which is what the point of Twitter was supposed to be. It's like, so why do we even need Twitter anymore? It all it's doing is inducing anxiety. People think the world is on fire. I that's right. I put this response of like, I have a group of friends who aren't on social media at all, like not even on it whatsoever. And they're super smart people. They know what's going on in the world, and they're doing just fine. And they're not on social media.
Yeah, and then I think there is an argument for that. I was talking to, again, this is a conversation that I have with many people, and it came up in a conversation. Steve, when you read a book, when you watch something, like a film and whatnot, there's a range of emotions that are involved. It's not necessarily happiness. It's not necessarily sadness. It's not necessarily anger. It's a collection of things, right? But if you go to a place like Twitter, and to a certain degree, some parts on Facebook or the YouTube comment section, what you primarily see is anger, right? People get frustrated or angry about a thing, and they leave their anger for you to read. And the next person who's angered by that anger leaves their anger. And you, doing your own thing, you come to that page or that thread, and all you just see is just anger permanently there for you to consume. And when you just consume that, it has an impact. When I see some of the debates that's happening on Facebook, I want to get in there and start I'm angry by reading other people's anger. And it's just permanently there. You can't, if you're in that environment, that is a perpetual, thing that happens. I mean, I'm not saying that that's all there is. There's some, really nice Twitter accounts that's just funny, just memes and whatnot. But fundamentally, what seems to be the driving force is it's driven by anger, division, and it is massively stressful and anxiety-inducing. That's why I'm like, I think I'm going to take a moment out.
I don't know how the people that are hyper involved with Twitter, a lot of celebrities or politicians, I do not know how they do it when they're tweeting like literally 10 times a day. They're angry just all the time, at least on Twitter. I don't know how that doesn't affect their psyche and their life. It was a bad influence. I saw it in real time, the effect that it can have on our mood. So my boyfriend, he's not on social media at all whatsoever, and I am, and it's kind of a light episode or example, so that's probably a good thing. Do you watch Game of Thrones?
Yes.
So there was all the outrage over the finale. I won't say anything else about it, but he was not happy with how it ended. And then the next day, like, he was over it. Like, he didn't really think about it. He was just like, it sucked. I was disappointed with it, whateve. And then I come rolling along and I'm like, oh my God, you have to see all these things on Twitter. They're so funny. All these memes, everyone's so angry. And I saw him, like, it's the rage start rising in him again. And I did that for like a week before I actually started realizing it. I was like, I keep bringing this anger back to him. And he was like over it. He was done. And I keep bringing it. And that's a small example. That's just a TV show.
Absolutely. And people who are, if you put that into a divisive subject matter, then you have people perpetually angry. That is not conducive to any meaningful conversation or any conversation that may progress from A to B. It's just perpetually stuck in this, really vicious cycle of just, when you're really angry, you can't really make informed decisions, or you don't really hear the other person because your anger is so all-consuming. And I'm not saying anger is unnecessary. Sometimes you need to be angry about things, but it's important to take a step back from that and that environment so you can actually then, all right, this happened, I got angry, now I'm okay, now what do I do about it? Like your boyfriend decided, you know what, it was a shitty ending, and then the next day he goes on with his life.
You can't do that now.
Yeah, but you can't do that if you're on social media. You just cannot. So
yeah. We also had on Lenore Skenazy, and she was talking about social media and also the 24-hour news cycle. And she was saying specifically in regards to parents and the anxiety that a lot of parents have now and overprotecting their kids because of it. And she was saying that, there's something in our brains that because like TV isn't supernatural to us, it rewatching the same news story over and over and over does something to our brain where it makes us think deep down that same incident is actually happening over and over and over. And her example was like watching a news story on a child being kidnapped. Our brains, every time you see a headline on that story or a picture of the missing child or something like that, it kind of makes you think it's actually happening like 100 times. And it does this weird thing to our brains, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, I love reading about neuroscience. I remember recently reading a book called Shallows. I forgot the name of the author, and it is really a study about what is happening to our brain when we are online, and it's kind of similar. And your rewiring of your brain happens within the first few hours of you being online. And that's what the data suggests. Like if you're, there's a controlled study of a group of people that were partaking in a social media group and activity for a very long time, and their brain was scanned, and you have the wiring of their brain, and then a group of people were introduced to that scenario for like 3 or 4 hours, and their brains were scanned before and after, and they could already see the rewiring happening in literally hours.
Wow.
And just reading things like that, I'm like, this has to change. We can't keep doing this. I mean, we're not going to evolve our way out of this. I think the change is happening too quick. We're not made for things like this.
Right. I know it's almost like they need some kind of like option where you can turn the algorithm off if you want. I don't know if that's an option now.
Yeah, thing, right? So if they do that, then that is going to hurt their bottom line, right? I mean, their entire business is based around that algorithm, which is, it would be amazing if you do it. I mean, the problem is, when we talk about, when people have arguments about capitalism, you talk about pharmaceutical companies and Fortune 500 companies. If you, and you talk about media, Rupert Murdoch comes in and things like that. If you really look at it right now, our world is primarily governed by a handful of tech companies, and the control they have over humanity, regardless of what their intentions are, it should worry all of us. Like I have an Android phone, and most of my activities is governed, monitored, and control may not be the right word, but to a certain degree controlled by Google. Where I go, my next meeting, my email, my primary communication apparatus for my business, email, it's all managed by this one entity. And then, the entertainment I consume on YouTube, same entity. Like, I can't escape Google. You can't live in a world, in the West at least, without Google, whether we like it or not. And then, I travel a lot. And when I was in India recently, and I wanted to catch a cab, and I don't want to just jump on a cab. I'm on Uber, and I realize I use Uber all around the world, wherever it's available. All of a sudden, this one entity globally manages my transportation. That can't be. This can't be okay. But they are so big, no one can enter and bring them any meaningful competition unless you have a authoritarian body like, say, the Chinese government, where they prevent from anybody else coming in. They create their own version, which itself is massively problematic. So trying to figure out how do we move forward? What do we do?
Do you know of any, if there are any competitors trying to compete, even as like difficult as it might be, because Google is a total behemoth, but I know of I know there's like Minds, which, to be honest, I'm not sure on the details yet, but I know they're trying to make some noise in the space, and their whole thing is touting like open source and free speech and things like that. Do you know of any other companies like that?
I honestly don't know. When I was in India, I saw massive billboards and ads for a search engine called JB. Again, it seemed quite customized to an Indian audience, and I don't know how that will work in a sort of a global scale. I've seen some ads that pop up called DuckDuckGo, which is another search engine. But again, from a perspective of new technology, I don't know anything out there that is challenging. And from a search engine perspective, from Google, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned your feminist event situation a couple times, and I wanted to ask you about that, because it kind of falls in, like, I think the aftermath of that event, which it sounds like you weren't really expecting, kind of falls in line with this conversation of social media and just the state of or probably the lack of conversation today. So this was actually the reason, or how I first found out about you, and what compelled me to reach out was you had this event. It was a conversation about feminism with feminists Christina Hoff Sommers and Roxane Gay. And there were a couple reasons why it kind of spoke to me after I watched it. The first one was just that I really appreciated how you, as a moderator, seemed to really work towards maintaining a balance and a fairness for both panelists, Christina and Roxane, which I feel like a lot of people these days who are putting on these events are either unable or unwilling to do. So I really appreciated that. But another reason was that I was really interested in your experience with trying to find a moderator for the event before eventually settling on yourself. Are you able to explain what happened?
I've been running, as I mentioned earlier, I've been running events for a very long time. It's always been behind the scenes, never been a person to be in front. If I ever have been, it is just talking about business and entrepreneurship and my immigrant experience. So this was an unusual scenario. And I know a lot of people still don't buy this story and don't believe me when I say this, but this is truth, what happened. When we announce an event, we've never had any trouble finding a host. We announce a tour, and then within minutes, people email me or message me saying, I'd love to host. That is something that is historically, whatever we've done has happened. This event, that didn't happen, I didn't think too much about it. And about 3 months out of the event, I started reaching out to people to potentially host. And as I mentioned during the intro of my event, these events aren't just sort of, just randomly plucked out. A certain amount of thought goes behind these events. So, we always have a preferred list of hosts. And the criteria we normally look into is the person shouldn't be on either side of the spectrum. It should be somebody with a capacity to have good conversation and also a bit of a profile. Whether the person is a journalist or a comedian or a television personality, even an academic that's able to have these kind of conversations. So I went through a list. Initially, I had about 5 people in mind. I reached out to all of them. The first person, my top pick, is a award-winning Australian journalist. I won't name her, but she got back to me like 10 minutes saying, no thanks. Her response was to the point, no thanks, but thank you for thinking of me. And I was like, oh, okay, no problem. She didn't give me no reason. Next person, was polite to say, thank you for thinking of me, but I'm going to pass on this one. Do let me know if there's anything else. The next person was something along the lines of, let me get back to you. But I could really sense something is not right. So I kept on trying. 10 people later, I couldn't find anyone. And when you organize an event like this, there's a lot of moving parts, and we're a small organization. So we were busy organizing the event and marketing the event. And 3 weeks out, we're like, oh, we don't have a host. What do we do? And that's when one of the people I reached out to, she's a friend of mine. She's also an award-winning journalist. Off the record, we caught up for dinner, and she said, you should get a man to host it. And I was like, oh, that's going to be controversial in itself. I don't want controversy for the sake of controversy. And she then explained to me her logic, and it made perfect sense. And then she hinted, you should consider. And I got some advice from a few people, and I thought, okay, all right, I'll host it. I asked Roxanne before the event, when she landed in Australia, a few days before the event, I asked her, are you okay if I host it? She was fine with it at that point. I asked, actually, before I even asked Christina, Christina proposed it to me. She's like, I know you don't have a host yet. Why aren't you hosting it? So she proposed it before I could say anything. So I was very happy. And I said, I'm thinking of doing it. I would ask Roxanne if she's comfortable with it. And that was that's what led to me hosting the event.
So why do you think so many people declined in the first place?
So I've been given, there's only one person that gave me, it's my friend, the journalist. She was the only one who told me why. Actually, sorry, let me correct myself. One of the well-known feminists, it's now public knowledge, so I can mention, she mentioned that she strongly disagreed with Christina Hoff Sommers, so she would be a hypocrite to share the stage with Christina. That's why she didn't want to host it. Everybody else just didn't give me a reason. And the only person that gave me a reason, she said, I can't be honest on stage because there are things I disagree with Roxanne. There are things I agree with Christina. But if I do that publicly as part of my organization and my public profile, I will lose my job. I would be called, right-wing nut job. I can't risk it. So she said, chances are almost everyone you're reaching out to is scared to host this because it's a very toxic area. That's why I no longer go to feminist events, because, it just frustrates me because no longer conversations are happening. It's just each group is preaching to their own audience. And I thought like, but this is a perfect place to, have that conversation. But she's like, well, kudos to you, but I don't want to be the person on stage. I'll be in the audience watching.
So, it's funny here. We've had on guests on both sides of the feminist conversation, and so we've received that reaction a little bit ourselves. Why do you think this is? I mean, not just feminism in general. I think controversial topics as a whole. Why is it come back to our conversation about like people not being able to have conversations? How do you think it's gotten this bad?
I think, again, it goes back to what we spoke about with regards to social media. Social media has somewhat leveled the playing field. Anecdotal evidence. I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeting about a scientific fact. He tweets about it, and one of the first comments that somebody came up with saying, well, you're wrong. And they had their own opinion. And there's this false idea that's given to people is your opinion about a certain subject matter is as valid as an expert's opinion on that subject matter. It's not to say all experts are always right, but we have experts for a reason. We don't try to diagnose ourselves, we go see a doctor. So, if there's a qualified doctor, we value their opinion. So when I saw that, it kind of hit me like, this is what people think. Somehow an astrophysicist claims a scientific fact, and some person somewhere on Twitter thinks their opinion is as valid or potentially better than Neil's opinion, or rather Neil's scientific fact. Right? People have missed the point in what is an opinion and what is a empirical fact. Right? And social media plays up to creating in-groups of people who agree with your potential opinion / fact. And more people have that, and you keep on that journey for a long time, and then you go into the real world, and then you can no longer have that conversation because you've either forgotten or you were never part of a conversation. You were part of this pseudo conversation online, which is having a go at the other and getting a massive group of agreement among your own people. So I think that's why we're no longer having conversations. We've lost the art of conversation.
Well, I think what's so interesting is that I guess in the conversation of social media, I think for us, like everyday non-intellectuals, it would make sense that we would kind of fall into these rabbit holes because we don't know any better. I think what's so strange with the feminism event was that you had scholars talking, and when trying to reach out to different moderators, I mean, you were saying award-winning journalists. I guess I would have thought that they would have known a little bit better than to have fallen into this like tribalism problem, but it doesn't seem that way.
I mean, look, it's a really valid point you make, but I think some of them, it was about the public image. And, that's sort of, my conversation with that one journalist, a friend of mine, kind of highlights that where, whatever she says publicly is not necessarily what she actually thinks or what she doesn't want to say publicly, because, we do have, sort of outrage culture, the cancel culture, so they don't want to be a part of it. And there's this other thing, I mean, we talk about in our movie where your intentions are good. You want to do the right thing by the people that you want, the minorities and the group of people that may not have a voice. And there's a group of people that, because you're not sure how to talk about it, the default position is, let me just not talk about it. And that's also part of the problem. And that all, again, stems from this outrage and cancel culture. So people are genuinely worried about talking about something, and people are also worried about saying, well, I don't know, or not taking a side. I mean, not taking a side itself seems it's deemed in this world somehow a bad thing, right? You either for or against us, period. Against right. Binary of the world, period.
Right. I know. I feel like there's like this pressure to be involved, to have an opinion.
Yeah.
You see this with a lot of companies too. It's like I see all these companies coming out with these hyper political ads and stances, and it's like, I guess if you as a company and a team truly feel that way, fine. But I almost feel like it's a marketing ploy where these marketers came in and they were like, hey guys, this is what the people want. They want us to take a stand. Let's try doing something. And oftentimes they like failed tragically.
But oftentimes they also succeed. Right.
True.
And True. Like what Nike did. Nike knew their audience. The sneaker buying audience tend to be. There's a very large portion of that are minorities. And when you play up what you want to play up to that audience, you're gonna sell a whole heap of sneakers. And that's an example of it working. I mean, I try to do. events that goes all over the spectrum. I remember, when I did the event with Majid Nawaz, there was a large group of people really didn't like me doing that event, and back then I was reading comments, and people were trying to figure out what's this guy's agenda, what is he trying to do, and they couldn't pigeonhole me because you have the event with Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz, and then the Majid Nawaz alone event, which they wanted to categorize as somehow a right-wing propaganda, but then the next event announced was Dr. Cornel West. So all of a sudden, wait, if he's right-wing, why is he working with Dr. West, who's, the darling of the left? He's a fantastic intellectual. I love both Sam Harris and Cornel West. They're both intellectuals in their own right. But you can't do that. If you're MSNBC or if you're CNN cannot take even remotely, if there is a neutral or pro-Trump situation, they cannot take that because they build the current form of CNN is anti-Trump. It is, that's how it works. I mean, they've built that brand and they now have to run with it. Fox cannot be anything other than anti-Democrats. It's just, that's the brand. That's what it is. So when you have Candy Jones and all these different people on either side of the spectrum, they have to play to their audience. And that's the problem, right? When you're playing to your audience, regardless of what facts hit your face, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's actually pretty crazy how for kind of lack of a better word and less controversial word, how planned and kind of manipulated these like mainstream channels are. Again, that's something that we're trying to fight against. I mean, we've heard from several insiders who have gone on mainstream channels quite a bit, and they've said, "Oh, they asked me for my opinion ahead of time, and it wasn't what they wanted to hear, so they canceled my appearance." Or I think the ratings went down for MSNBC when they found out that Trump wasn't colluding with Russia, or the report came out and they didn't indict him, because that's what they had built their entire show on the last 2 years. Their ratings plummeted right after that, from what I heard.
Yeah, I mean, see, this is the thing, right? CNN apologized for their part in getting Trump elected because they have end-to-end Trump rallies, but I think that was disingenuous. I think they, like right now, do you think they're going to stop talking about Trump? Hell no, that entire place is based around, there are certain comedians, their entire monologues and the whole thing is based around Trump, attacking Trump. I mean, the thing is, I'm not saying don't talk about the president of America. The world has to talk about him, but the way the media talks about him is it plays straight into the hand of Trump. And Trump, you can't avoid him because media keeps giving him a platform. Yesterday it was about what he said about Meghan, and today it's about what he said about the mayor of London. Tomorrow it'll be, I don't know, he walked funny somewhere. It's just, there will be something because of the personality of the man they are reporting on. There's always going to be something, but everything is at like, oh my God, it's here, constantly here.
Right. And that's the irony of it, is that because everything is always at level 10, that if he ever does something that's like undeniably bad or controversial or whatever, nobody really pays attention because everything they talk about is the worst thing in the world.
Exactly. I mean, that's the problem. And look, I appreciate, what you're doing. There are outlets out there that's trying to sort of buck the trend. But the challenging situation is, if you look at the data, it's not like people have left mainstream, especially television. Television audience are, growing a little bit, not exponentially, but it's there was a trend that it went down, but it's now back up and it's staying there. So people are consuming more content on digital mediums and consuming traditional media. So my worry is information overload, right? If you put a conscious effort, you can pick, for example, podcasts. I listen to Ezra Klein and Sam Harris. because I know they don't necessarily agree on things, but but I don't think everyone puts in that much effort to figure out, all right, I'm going to listen to this bit and this bit and blah, 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 blah. Again, I hope, there will be things that people don't categorize to take a side. It's neutral enough so people will go back to what news or current affairs or entertainment programs that used to be. It doesn't necessarily take a stance per se. It's relatively neutral. That's what news should be.
That's what I say. I say I want my news boring and factual.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, but maybe we are being idealistic. Maybe the news as we know it is something in the past. Maybe today's news is entertainment. I mean, in the New York Magazine article about the incident of feminists, they refer to a Sydney Morning Herald article. Sydney Morning Herald is one of the biggest publications in this country, and that journalist, the way she reported the event, you read that article, you read the New York Magazine article, their article was, I don't know, about 800 words versus 5,000 words. You have a journalist who did his research and wrote that article. Then you had somebody who attended one event and wrote about the entire tour from one perspective. It was an opinion piece, but reported as news. And I was reading that and I called that journalist. I'm like, that's not what happened. You had an interview with me. Why did you exclude this part and this part? Because if you include those two parts, your entire story changes. And her response was, well, I don't have 2,000 words to write everything. But I'm like, by excluding this part, you change the narrative fundamentally. And she refused to change the article and just stuck by it.
See, and that's what's so scary is that I feel like so many so-called journalists now are actually commentators or activists. And they're being just trusted as journalists. And I feel like because we try to be like hyper aware of it, it's like all you do is read the 500 word one. You're like, oh, well, this is clearly an unresearched opinion piece, but it's not labeled as such. And I think people not paying attention probably wouldn't think that. And
my request for that journalist was, okay, you have the right to write anything, right? But at least label it as an opinion piece. That was my request. I didn't ask her. I asked, why did you do it? But I didn't ask her to necessarily change the article. I simply said, title it as an opinion, which is fine. You're right to have an opinion. But when it was reported as a news article, that's when you have a skewed, like whoever's reading it, on your social media feed, very quickly, it's an easy read, very quick read, and you then form an opinion about something based on a fundamentally flawed set of information.
Well, and I've heard that there might actually be a benefit to that, or at least not bad consequences, because the way that, you probably know this, but how a lot of monetizations work online with articles and video content and whatnot is that usually it's whatever the first hit of the piece is, or of traffic. So when you first put a piece out, however much traction it gets the first hour or day dictates how well it's going to do and how much money you'll make. And then after that, it kind of falls off. So yes. Unfortunately, platforms kind of have an incentive to make things to not focus on the truth and focus on what their readers want to see. And then, because they can always go back and do a retraction, but they've already made the money from the drama.
And then that goes back to something we spoke right at the beginning. It's exactly how monetization works. It's how Google AdWords work. Whatever programmatic platforms out there for any online platform to make money. Unfortunately, that's how it works. So you're right. There is no monetary incentive unless you build enough of an audience through that supports you to do the right thing, whether it is through a subscription basis or some other basis. You're right. No real organization have that inbuilt, and that is something that we as a collective have to figure out, how do we change this? This cannot keep going on. We have to fundamentally change things. I mean, for me, dragging people from their lounges from their homes to a live event is crucial, because that human interaction is, I believe, is quite important for you to change a position or understand a position. Again, referring to that meeting I had just before this, was this young lady was telling me how she dragged her boss, who had certain views about feminism, and when he came there, he in the next few days, he apparently became a better human being after that experience of the event. He started understanding some of the things that, why feminists do some of the things they do, regardless of, some as he called it, apparently a traumatic experience, because he was one of the very few men there, and he used the word, he was worried that he was going to get lynched for being a man there.
That's dramatic.
Of course, but the point is, live events have an impact, and one of the things we could potentially do is take a step back from the giant online environments and have more one-on-one conversations. Go back to a scenario where the human one-on-one conversations have more of it. How do we do more of that effectively?
It kind of back to what you were saying about that event you had where you made all the different groups live together for a few days.
Yeah, I mean, so that was a very different kind of event. That was, the impact of that it's seen now. A country's future was depending on that. Like, so Sri Lanka will never go back to another sectarian war. It was important we work with youth leaders. They weren't being indoctrinated. It was just simple human connection. And what really drove it home, a country like Sri Lanka in the subcontinent, the biggest sport is cricket. So we put them in cricket teams, and after the first game, they were cheering for their cricket team, which was made out of multiple ethnicities. Then they forgot their own ethnicity. They were cheering for that particular team, and then that kind of sort of then. At the end of the 5 days, they worked out, we're all the same. It just but activities and that real life interaction drove it home. They can read about it. All of them have read about being kind to each other, respecting other cultures, but then they lived through it. They had this one-on-one experience, which then drove it home.
So I heard someone say once, I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about how important it is that we try and maintain our communal hobbies as much as possible, like sports or concerts or whatever. And their point was that, like, as trivial as these things might seem, they're actually incredibly important in getting everyone out of their heads, out of these strong opinions and issues that we're talking about, to come together for something kind of fun and that you can unite on, because it's not, let's say sports, like it's a sport, it's not politics. Like you can easily unite with someone you disagree with on every other issue to cheer on a team. And their point was just how important that is to like a society and a community. And I thought it was a really good point.
I completely agree with it, and in a strange way, what I want to do is, how do we get thousands of people come to intellectual events and have sort of that communal effect? You don't have to agree with that person, right? And later today, I will be sitting down with Omaima. Her tweet went viral on the back of the feminist event. She is an ex-Muslim who was in the audience, and her comment was, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, she felt betrayed by the feminist movement, the Western feminist movement, as an ex-Muslim woman who was sitting in the audience and listening to Roxanne and her response. She felt quite alienated, and seeing that sort of, how the crowd reacted to the response of Roxanne, which is online, you can watch it.
Would you mind actually recapping that quickly, just so people know the context?
Yeah. Sure. So the context is, I had a question to Roxanne primarily. Do Western feminists have a bigger role to play when it comes to activists in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, where countries they are genuinely oppressed? And her response was, yes, but the activists in those countries know better. I'm paraphrasing, but you can listen to the full explanation. And Roxanne has said that in the past, which I personally think is a bit of a cop-out. I think it's not really a genuine answer. It's this idea of, it's their culture, they know best, let's not tell them what to do, because who are we to tell them what to do? But when it comes to, certain aspects of life, regardless of your culture, if your culture tells me, marrying and raping young children is an okay thing, fuck your culture. I will say it's a universal thing that everybody across the world should be able to say. It's not partisan to say that. And just like that, being able to challenge certain cultural norms, from a feminist perspective, should be quite normal, but it doesn't happen. So I asked that question, but I also presented a video from Indonesia where the Sharia police, by the way, the video is from a very progressive network over here, where the Sharia police is policing these young women who are fully covered, going about their day and stopping them and detaining them for the fact their jeans are too tight. And the Sharia police says these awful things. And I wanted to present it and ask the question, how do you respond to something like this? And, I was pillared for that question. Roxanne and her audience thought it was very manipulative of me trying to represent that culture with that video clip. I'm like, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm asking this one specific question. And that response was from Roxanne, was like, who are we to tell them what to do, kind of response, which Umayma, who was in the audience, she's an ex-Muslim, she's an activist. She actually wrote an article about her experience. It was published by Quillette. She felt quite alienated by that response, and rightfully so, because again, it's a cop-out. That's not really a response.
So, and I'm sorry, what you had mentioned her because you guys are going to be working together?
Yeah. So later today, I was invited by the IDW Sydney for a conversation with her. And I think it's a small gathering. We're just going to have a conversation about, I think the title of the event is, hold on, let me get that. I don't want to get this wrong. It is called, We Need to Talk About Feminism. And, my mind and I, we're just going to have a bit of a conversation. It's going to start from what happened at this event and, what it means for the movement and the byproduct of that. And and the articles that came out, the publications, and the ongoing conversation online about post-event and what it means to the ex-Muslim movement, and things like that.
Oh, that's so interesting. And actually,
and put it out there.
What was that?
Hopefully, I can record the conversation today and maybe put it out there.
Oh, I actually did want to ask because I thought that debate was really well done. Do you guys always film and publish your debates?
I want to correct you. It wasn't a debate. It was a conversation. It came across as a debate because I made sure I told everybody this is not going to be a debate. I'm not going to put Roxanne on this side, Christina on this side, and I stay in the middle as an adjudicator. It's not going to be like that. I would like it to be a conversation that progressed somewhere. With that said, with This is 42, yes, the plan is to when we have the ability and the rights are given to us, is to produce as many quality content from our events as possible and put it out there. With my previous organization, we didn't do that.
So now I also wanted to ask you about your film as well, because I really love that you're so open to talk about these controversial issues. So I'm really interested in your experience. So you co-directed and co-produced the film, The Islam and the Future of Tolerance, with Sam Harris and Mijad Nawaz, who, I mean, kind of like you just said, it was a film about a conversation about Islam. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, with that film, if you take out the subject Islam out of it, it's really a movie about conversation. Conversation is all we have. And as Sam says in the movie, we've had enough violence. Let's try to have a better conversation. The subject matter is Islam, which is, by the default title of the movie, people think that it's somehow controversial. If you watch the movie, and I highly encourage your audience to go watch the movie. It's available on iTunes and Google Play and Vimeo. Please watch it to understand we don't really take a side. The movie it doesn't have a solution for a problem per se. It is simply giving you the tools to have better conversations about a very complex subject matter. And we picked it because the conversation has been hijacked by two groups of people who doesn't seem to want a real solution. You have the political right who blame the entire world's problems and for a long time on one group of people, not understanding that 1.6 billion Muslims aren't the same. If you tell a Sufi, somebody who practices Sufi version of Islam versus Wahhabi version of Islam, you would think, well, they're two different religions. It feels like it because they're so different, and that's what it is. And people also didn't, especially in the right, didn't realize the difference between who is a Muslim and what is Islam. One is a group of people, and one is an ideology. And there are lots of cultural Muslims, right? And right was running with this narrative that the whole world's problem is because of this one group of people. And then you had my people, the left, were petrified by the idea of talking about something that they knew inherently goes against liberal values. They knew certain elements of this religion and some of its teachings was inherently problematic. They were okay to challenge Christianity quite openly and its issues of homophobia and range of other science denialism. But they were very scared to talk about that within this one ideology because they were worried it will give ammunition to the right who's running with it right now. And the byproduct of that was massively failed conversation. And I wanted to, having access to somebody like a Sam Harris and a Majid Nawaz, and Jay Shapiro, my co-director, we realized, we have to tell this story. And we hopefully, online has been quite kind in this regard. It seems like we've done an okay job.
Oh, that's good. Because I wanted to ask, what was the reaction to that? Because it seems like you didn't have a good reaction to the feminist event per se. Was it?
Yeah. I mean, this is the funny thing. I want to give credit to Christina of Summers, who desperately tried to get this message across. She made a point to say to Roxanne that if Sam Harris can talk to Jordan Peterson about God, who they fundamentally disagree with it, for hours and hours and hours and hours, and continue doing it, and if Douglas Murray can talk to Cornel West about political ideological differences for hours and hours, why can't Roxane Gay and Christina Summers have a conversation about feminism without resorting to what ended up happening? And when I made the movie of Islam and the Future of Tolerance, it was very well received. It was critically really well received. IMDb, we still have 9 out of 10, and I think it's only 1 or 2 people out of the 100, closer to 100 reviews that had a negative reaction, but the negative reaction was so far on the spectrum. That's why we had 9 out of whatever. Last I checked, on Amazon we have 5 out of 5 of 60 plus reviews. iTunes we have 5 out of 5. So the response, if you watch the movie, it's an intellectual movie. Regardless where in the spectrum you are with regards to this subject matter, I think you can appreciate the movie.
How do you guys decide on the topics you're going to cover in your work, your films, your events that you're going to have?
It's whatever. I mean, look, I started off, my initial idea was just touring my intellectual superheroes. It was like, I hope enough people cared about the stuff I cared about. That's how I started. But nowadays, it's more sort of we're looking out to see what issues are there and, who's talking about what and what is helping us progress. So anytime there's a speaker or an intellectual who's talking about something that's helping us progress. That's sort of how I look at things, and that's what I want to give a platform to.
Do you ever get worried about your work, and because you do get such a strong reaction one way or another, does that ever get to you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from a business perspective, I don't get sponsors. Like events in this space traditionally have attracted many sponsors, but I don't get sponsors because brand look up what we've done and they're like, no, you're too controversial. And it's very difficult. Like the feminist event, contrary to popular belief, it lost a ton of money. And, I knew I wasn't going to make any money. I thought I'd at least break even, but no, it didn't. And I still went ahead with it. And I knew I was going to lose some money months out, but I went ahead with it because I believe the conversation was important. And I do worry. And, now I have a couple of investors. Luckily, they see things in a different light, and they see as part of what they have been doing, investing in organizations that sort of pander to a certain ideology or not getting into controversial subject is the reason that world is so divided. So they feel like, okay, maybe we should fund people like you so we can have a bit of an equilibrium.
Right, like they can help someone in the space of intellectual conversations, but not one that is inherently one side or the other.
Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, we're learning every day what an interesting space that we're in trying to, make money as independent content creators, and also talking about topics that aren't always easy to hear, and how interesting that is when it comes to, advertisers or other, revenue streams.
Yeah, I know it's an ongoing challenge, and I hope you guys have figured out something. On the back. I mean, it came out on the back of the feminist event, but we are producing a lot of content, and we plan to produce a lot more content. We put out a podcast. We have a couple of video series online. We plan to produce more events and turn it into content, and we've got an awesome podcast coming out. We hosted by Jay Shapiro and Coleman Hughes.
We had Coleman Hughes on.
Yeah, it's Coleman is amazing.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I'm going to see him on the weekend because he's in Australia.
Tell him I said hi.
I will pass on. But yeah, I think we have a job on our hand, and I think we should somehow. I think it is important. People like you and I, we figure out a way to have a reasonably successful business doing what we're doing, because if we do this and we are successful somehow, it will encourage more people to get into this space, and that means there'll be better conversations.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask, how did you come up with the name This Is 41?
42.
42, my goodness, I knew that. I don't know why I said 41. This is 42.
So I'm sure your crew may have, your team, there'll be some people who know the meaning of 42. If you're not sure,
everyone's nodding their head. Yes, I actually don't. I'm the only one here who doesn't know.
That's what I'm saying. They will appreciate what I'm about to say. It would be a travesty if I take away from your journey you're about to have, finding out what 42 means.
Oh.
I shouldn't go online and just ask the question, what does 42 mean? And my tagline gives away a little bit of it. My tagline is find meaning. Go online, and if your audience they're not sure what 42 means, go, and there's going to be a meta journey that you will come out saying, "Oh my God, I didn't know," and then you'll start seeing it everywhere.
This sounds really intense.
No, it started off as a tongue-in-cheek thing, and it has a story of its own now grown. It's just a little bit of fun.
I will. I totally will. And maybe our now you have to you're forcing our users to do the same thing too, which is kind of fun.
Yes. Please do.
Well, Desh, is there anything else that you would like to talk about or cover that you don't think we got to?
No, I mean, look, I as I said, I am incredibly grateful for you to inviting me. I love these conversations. I appreciate that. I from where I come from and where I plan to head, I'm grateful for the privileges I have, and I think we covered a range of topics. It's been a fascinating conversation, and keep doing what you're doing. Only thing I'd like to add is, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'm easily contactable. I'm on social media. There's a website, but keep following. This is 42. We will be putting on a lot of events, and I might actually, I don't know when this will come out, but we are actively working on launching This is 42 America, and this is not public knowledge yet. I may have jumped the gun. But so keep an eye out. I definitely want to work in America and put on a range of events over there.
Oh, wonderful. And where can people find you guys online?
Thisis42.com is our main website, and if you search for This is 42, you'll find all of our social media. I highly recommend following us on Facebook if you're on Facebook. I know we just bagged social media for a while, but this is the only way we can get to you. If you want a better way to get in touch with us, go to our website and subscribe to our email database. We don't spam. That is probably the best way. And YouTube. Subscribe to us on YouTube, and we will be putting out some solid content.
Yeah, and us too. Subscribe to us too.
This conversation, and hopefully if you get anything, obviously I'll be putting out this conversation to my audience, and I'll be telling everyone to subscribe to you guys. So again, appreciate what you're doing.
Wonderful. Well, Desh, thank you so much. I mean, like you just said, I was so excited that I came across the event because your work seemed to be so much in line with what we're trying to do, and so it's really nice to see other people sensing this problem of the lack of communication and trying to do something about it, trying to bring a little bit more lightness to the world. So, I hope this isn't the last time that we talk. But I'm so happy with like what we were able to talk about today. I think it was really cool.
Absolutely. Again, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Desh. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.